our assumptions about those things are fueling everything that we do. To go back to those predominantly blokes who seem very invested in ensuring that women's work isn't valued, they're also very invested in the maintenance of those gender norms.
This is Fairy Tale Princesses Will Kill Your Children, and I'm your host, Jane Gilmore. First, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're recording, the Wurundjeri people, and recognise that words alone are not enough to close the gap caused by invasion and colonisation. I ask you to join me in action as well as words in acknowledging this by doing things like giving to Aboriginal legal services, or if you can't do that, reading, listening, or watching art, analysis and research produced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This podcast is a series of 6 episodes loosely based on my book, Fairy Tale Princesses Will Kill Your Children. You don't need to read the book to listen to the podcast, although, of course, I would be thrilled if you did buy the book. If you're in Australia, I'd love it if you could buy it directly from my website, janegilmore.com, links in the show notes, because that helps me keep the lights on, but you can also get it at any online bookseller. For the book, I rewrote from a feminist perspective 5 traditional fairy tales: Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, The Little Mermaid, and Beauty and the Beast. When I was writing the book, it became very clear that there were dominant themes in each of those 5 stories. This is the second episode, and we're talking about Cinderella. In the Grimm brothers' version of Cinderella, her mother dies in the first sentence, and by the end of the first paragraph has been replaced by, of course, an evil stepmother. The Grimm brothers' Cinderella is an innocent, beautiful girl who suffers at the hands of a wicked older woman and bad-tempered, avaricious stepsisters. They mock her and force her to do all the unpaid labour of running a large household. Even the name her mother gave her is erased and replaced with a sneer. She always looks dusty and dirty, so they call her Cinderella. Cinderella proves her moral worth as a woman by doing all this work without complaint. Not even without complaining, but by finding her self-worth in silent sacrifice of her own feelings and future for the good of her family. In contrast, the wicked stepmother and stepsisters are defined as evil by their refusal to do unpaid work and their selfish pursuit of their own desires. Then the king holds a 3-day festival and invites all the beautiful young girls in the town so his son can choose a bride. Cinderella has no family or friends other than her neglectful father and her cruel stepfamily, so she goes to her mother's grave to ask for help. There's no fairy godmother in the original story, but magic birds bring her a beautiful dress that transforms her from a dirty servant into a stunning woman. This transformation was as much about class as it was about beauty. Poverty was considered dirty and shameful. Rich gowns appearing by magic were Cinderella's passport to wealth, because not even a beautiful and pure young girl could find a handsome prince if she remains visibly poor. So she goes to the festival, the handsome prince takes one look at her and falls instantly in love. The first 2 nights of the festival, she dances with him for a while and then runs away. On the last night, he is determined to find her, despite her obvious wishes that he doesn't, because clearly she's just playing hard to get. So he pours sticky oil on the steps, and as she leaves, one of her shoes is stuck to the step as she escapes. The handsome prince then makes all the women in the town try on the shoe because his bride must prove her perfection, and of course he can't recognise Cinderella by just looking at her. At their mother's bidding, Cinderella's evil stepsisters take a knife and cut off their toes and heels so they can fit their great big evil feet into the cast-off shoe. Disgusted by their blood, the handsome prince rejects them. He asks Cinderella's father if he has any other daughter, and the father replies, and this is a direct quote, by the way, from the Grimm brothers' book, "There is still a little stunted kitchen wench which my late wife left behind, but she cannot possibly be your bride." Despite her father's denial that she is his daughter or a suitable bride for the prince, the shoe fits. The handsome prince declares he has found his true love. They get married, and at the wedding, magic birds tear out the evil stepsister's eyes, and the story ends happily. Yep. More wholesome good fun for children because, of course, all good women love doing housework and only evil stepsisters who will never find a husband want a life that is more than just unpaid and unrecognised work. My guest for this episode is the wonderful Wil Stracke, Assistant Secretary of the Victorian Trades Hall Council. Wil has a huge amount of experience dealing with the ways we value work, particularly women's work. Welcome to the podcast, Wil.
Thank you for having me here.
So, tell me about the value we put on what is still seen as women's work.
Oh, we don't put much value on it at all. Well, it depends whether we're talking unpaid or paid work, because in either case, we don't value it properly. Women still do the great bulk of the unpaid work of caring for families, households, communities, and we don't place any value on that at all. And then there's the work that women do. Women are clustered predominantly in caring sectors, and we have historically not measured the skill involved in doing that work. We've not paid it properly. We haven't valued it. So we have this tendency to see it as women's work and to see it as an extension of that unvalued work that women do in the household. So, for example, if you're a youth worker and you work with young kids living on the streets who, for various complex reasons of trauma, have ended up not with their families and couch surfing or struggling with various issues, it's kind of seen as being a bit like being a mum of a teenager. And so we tend to kind of just see that as something that I suppose anyone can do rather than seeing it as complex work that requires high levels of skill, high levels of experience, and we're not good at measuring the skills involved in doing that work at all.
Yeah, and I've worked in domestic violence frontline services where the same thing applies.
Absolutely.
It's not only the level of skill that's involved, but it's also genuinely dangerous work.
Yep, absolutely.
Really, really dangerous work, and that's not valued at all either.
No, I think that's right. We don't understand the work for a start. And then because we don't understand the work, we don't understand either the skill, the risk, the challenge, the various what you need to be able to do that work. It's largely invisible work, right? And it's looking after or it's supporting people that we also don't value, and consequently it becomes doubly unvalued.
Yeah, and to be clear about the dangerous work, just for everyone listening, I'm not just talking about physically dangerous or making yourself a target of violent and abusive men, although that is also part of it, but the dangerous work of sitting there day after day, listening to those stories, fighting a structure that is absolutely insurmountable, trying to get help and support for them when no help and support exists, that moral injury, as well as all the trauma that you're taking on board, that moral injury of being powerless to help.
Yeah, I think it's very hard. It's relentless work because it never ends. And the other struggle is obviously it's underfunded, which means the workers are also struggling against the fact that they can't deliver what they want to deliver. So they're doing the work, they have the skill, but they can't deliver what the services that somebody needs because it's not valued. The clients aren't valued, the work isn't valued, and they aren't valued.
Yeah, and that's replicated in, say, childcare, where you look at some of the most underpaid skilled workers in the country is in childcare, and they do amazing work.
Early childhood educators who support effectively, those first 5 years of life are critical, right?
Yeah.
So they're doing incredibly important work, and yet we don't see it as a skill. We don't recognise them as educators. We don't see what's involved in doing that. So it's not properly valued.
Where does that come from? Is that from those myths of, the Cinderella myth of, just women do this because we love it?
I think some of it's that. It's also relatively new as professional work, because if you think about it, a lot of this work was historically done by volunteer services. So family violence is a classic example, right, where those early services were largely driven by volunteers, women who would set these things up and then volunteer their time supporting other women through. It was often middle-class women who would do this because they had the capacity and the time to do it, right? So some of it is because that's where it comes from. It comes from a place of volunteerism. But over the course of time, we've increasingly understood the complexity of the problems that people face, and consequently we've understood that you need to be pretty educated and skilled to deliver this work. But that perception of it as kind of volunteering remains in place. And it is also because, I think it is purely a factor that it is largely dominated by women and it's government funded. And so governments get away with not funding it properly because the work gets done, right? So the workers that do it are incredibly dedicated. And so because they believe in a cause greater than themselves, they get taken advantage of in that process, right? So it's become increasingly professional. It started off as a volunteer kind of job. It's become increasingly professional. We haven't recognised that by paying people more because we haven't recognised the skill in doing that. Our systems to do that are very slow. So, Fair Work systems, the industrial systems, they just haven't kept up with what's happened. They haven't even kept up with the fact that women are now in massive numbers in the workforce, right? We're still kind of seen a bit like women are working until they get married and have children. And we haven't, I think about it and I say, I'm the first generation of woman in my family to have had a career. My mother worked, but she didn't have a career. So part of it is also our expectations as women of the work and how we will be treated. And I still think women feel kind of grateful to have it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Still feel like we're lucky to have had a job. I feel lucky to have had a career.
Yeah, which is funny because women have always worked. Throughout history, women have worked.
Completely, always. And in fact, there was, if you think about it, I always love the story of beer, right, which was made by women. It was women's work to do that and do that until it became industrial, and then we manufactured it in huge numbers, and then suddenly it was a men's thing, right? It was the kind of capital came in and suddenly it wasn't seen that way. But women made beer for the community.
They did, and we did talk about witches in the last episode, but I love when making beer used to be women's work. They would take the beer to market, and so that everybody at the market could see them, they'd wear big pointy black hats so that people could see them over crowds. And obviously, when you're making beer, you need lots of wheat, you need all the grains and everything that go into it. So you need cats to keep the rodents away, and you need a broom to sweep all the crumbs out.
Completely.
Suddenly, oh my God, all these women are making money and having power out of the beer industry. Well, we've got to do something about that.
Yes.
Tie them into the witch myth.
Yes.
Yes, I love that story. There's a couple of other things that tie into this because I know that just women generally, their work is undervalued, underpaid. And when women say, hey, that's a bit fucked, then the response is often, well, how dare you be so demanding? Why aren't you doing this caring work because you love it, because it's good, worthy work? How dare you be so demanding as to ask for actual money for it? But then you run into all those other intersections of work that's, say, primarily done by women of colour. So I'm thinking of things like aged care, where there is a lot of women of colour still doing skilled work, because anybody who's dealt with older relatives, that is not just something anyone can do. It is not just something anyone can do. You really have to know what you're doing and have real skill to do it. But it's primarily women of colour who do it. And again, I think next to childcare workers, the lowest paid of any job in Australia.
Well, I mean, the upside is that early childhood educators, that we have a government now that has changed laws, which means that they will get a pay increase. So that 15% pay increase, that's fantastic. And the aged care work value case means that aged care workers are going to get pay increases as well, as did in 2012, the social and community services workers. So the systems are working better now. They've been tweaked and changed, so that's a positive. And I do think the "you're fucked for asking for more" thing it's not as overt as it was in the past. I think most people would say now, early childhood educators, they deserve better than they're getting. I reckon most people also understand that aged care workers, I think people are beginning to get that that's a complicated, as each generation ages and is looking after people at home, I think everybody goes, whoa, that work is actually really hard. And also because the nature of aged care's changed. It actually these days, we want as many people to stay at home as possible, which means by the time someone gets into care, they are complex needs. It's no longer possible for them to be at home. It's no longer possible for families to look after them. This idea that you kind of go into the glories of the retirement home and that not so much anymore. Now people stay in their homes. They get cared for at home if they need a bit of extra support. And by the time they get into aged care, I think most people go, whoa, that is complicated and hard work. So I think broadly, those perceptions are changing. My experience, I do a bit of social media about this, and my experience of the feedback that comes from, there is a cohort of, I would describe predominantly men, who are challenged by the idea that work has value and it should be recognised as having skill. And I don't know what that's about. There seems to be an attachment. I don't understand why there seem to be some men who are challenged by the idea that women's work wages might rise and that women's work might be valued. I think broadly as a community we now accept that, but there do seem to be pockets where there's a level of resentment about that.
Do you think that's because of the feeling that men's work is becoming less valued, those traditional men's labouring jobs, that tradies, that there's some of that is being felt like it's being taken away?
Maybe. I mean, it's an interesting question, right? Because it's a question I often ask the people who make those comments, which is, I'm not seeking to devalue the skill involved in doing any of those trades that you are talking about, because actually I do think they're skillful trades, and I don't want to see anybody go backwards. I want everybody to get I'm a trade union official. I want everyone to get a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. So absolutely. So what is it about this doesn't impact you in any way? Like if early childhood educators get a pay increase, it doesn't impact you and your work in any way. All it does is it lifts that work up and we value it better. And yet you're very busy here trying to say that they shouldn't get that in some way the work is nothing. It's nothing. Anyone could do it, right? And if they really wanted to do hard work, they should go and be a labourer. And I'm like, well, no, we can value the work. All of the work is valuable, right? All of the contributions are valuable. So I don't think it's a broad societal thing anymore, but I do think there are pockets that still have that view, and there's something about a loss in that. They can't describe what the loss is, but there's something about a loss in that.
Yeah, there's a feeling that if you get something, you must be taking it from me to get it.
And it's whether that's a actual money thing or whether it's a status thing or I don't know what it is. I don't understand it. I'm quite happy that I don't understand it. But there is something for some of them. There's something in that for some of them, but not for all of them.
No, but the ones I've spoken to have that attitude because I've met them too. They often present themselves to me on the internet.
Yes.
They're fun. But I feel like they don't really know why they're doing it either. They don't have an articulate argument where they can say, well, this is why I have a problem with it. They just have a problem with it and want to say so loudly. But you can't get them to actually articulate it. The feeling that I get from them is threat somehow, that this is a threat.
I think that's right. And I think they're also some of them, they're very bound up in the gender norms, the notion that men do certain kind of work, women do certain kind of work, and they're very bound up in that. So they say, women don't want to do certain kinds of work, right? Because women wanted to earn more, they should just go and do the work that we're doing. And then you say, well, actually there are actually structural barriers to women doing that. Women apply to do that work. And then, for instance, women who go into trades, they're still today told things like, you don't want to do that, you might break a nail. Or like that, those notions are still there. So actually there are structural barriers to women going and doing that. And there are assumptions and stigmas associated with men who want to go in and do childcare work, for instance, like early childhood education. So we still have those gender norms so deeply embedded. And I think those of us who are fighting to undo those because we think the world would be better if, I think everybody's health would be better and everyone would be happier if we could just do the work that we might want to do, then I don't necessarily understand why people are so bound up. But I think there is still a kind of so deeply embedded notion of gender norms and how we value the different things as well, like the work that men do and that kind of, versus the work that women are doing.
And it's really interesting when you start digging into it because you can't talk about patriarchy without talking about capitalism because they are two sides of the same coin. And capitalism depends on producing things that you can sell, physical things that you can sell or even non-physical things, but something that you can buy and sell. And as you said earlier, a lot of that gendered women's work, like caring for children or caring for people who are trying to escape violence, caring for people in aged care, it's not producing a thing you can sell.
It doesn't generate profit.
Well, it actually does, though. I mean, in a more abstract way.
No, I agree, because I say, well, actually it does, because if you want to produce the widgets, you need the workers to be healthy, and generally the people providing the healthcare services are likely to be women, right? And if you want to build the building, someone's got to be looking after the kids and doing that. And these days for households, where generally everybody needs two incomes these days to kind of get a roof if you want to buy property or whatever you want to do. And that means then someone's got to be looking after young people and getting them, like kids, and getting them through, and that's predominantly going to be women who are doing that work, which is all contributing generally to the profit that we make in society. I will say the binding up of patriarchy and capitalism, it is so deeply embedded together. But I do sometimes think, people say, I don't know that any other economic system has ever undone the patriarchy. Like, I haven't seen it ever. So I agree that the way we manifest capitalism is that the patriarchy is deeply embedded. But I don't know that there's an economic system that actually has ever disentangled the two, because whenever I look at other systems, the countries that are notionally socialist and all of that, I still see the patriarchy at work.
You're absolutely right. And I was thinking about this the other day. I was reading Simon Sharma's book about the French Revolution, which is fascinating. I mean, it's just a fascinating book, although I still haven't forgiven Simon Sharma for setting the trend for historians talking about the past in the present tense, but we'll put that aside. A couple of things really stood out to me. One of them, the pamphleteers during the French Revolution and all the misinformation and disinformation, the slut-shaming of Marie Antoinette that exists to this day, which was the precursor to social media. Mm-hmm. It operates in exactly the same way that social media operates now. I just did Simon Sharma. It operated in exactly the same way that social media operates now, and it was used for exactly the same purposes. But then if you look at the economic system at the time, which was not capitalism, it was the divine right of kings and almost a feudal system, that economic power imbalance, which is the fundamental underpinnings of capitalism, you're right, that it was still completely underpinned there, and women were banned from public life.
Yeah, so I think about it and I go, yes, the way our capitalist system has manifested, it absolutely relies on the undervaluation of women's work, right? It absolutely relies on women doing still the great bulk of that unpaid care work. Without that, our society is not going to function. Our capitalist system is not going to function. So it's inbuilt into the capitalist system. But I also think it's inbuilt into any economic system. Any economic system is relying on that, predominantly because the people who are driving the bulk of the economic system that we implement are men, and consequently, because they generally have the positions of power to do that. And so what that means is they build it into any system.
Yes.
The assumptions about women's work, the assumptions about how things should be valued, it's inbuilt because the people who have the power to manifest the systems generally are men, and consequently they benefit from the undervaluation of women's work and women doing the great bulk of that work.
Yes, and I don't think that they're doing it consciously, that it's not like they're all sitting around stroking white cats going, how can we keep women poor? But in the way, well, maybe some of them are.
I think some of them are.
Some of them are, yeah. But I do think that most of them will be saying, well, how can we make things better? And their perception of things being better is a wholesome family life with mummy at home baking biscuits and daddy going off to work at a good, secure job. That sort of bullshit view of nostalgic 50s thing that never happened. But that idea of that's a way to keep people happy and to maintain stability. So if we can make a world where that's possible, everyone will be happy.
I just think our gender norms are so deeply embedded. Like, if you think about it, kids who hit school are already assuming that girls are better at English and boys are better at maths, right? Yet the testing, I don't think it fully confirms that.
No, it doesn't.
That that's the case, right?
It absolutely
and yet
doesn't.
That's deeply embedded. Mm-hmm. Parents, the idea of who is a leader, kids are already arriving at school with notions that boys are leaders, etc., right? And I don't know that anyone's doing that. I don't think anybody's doing that deliberately or consciously.
No.
So what that means is our assumptions about those things are fueling everything that we do. And that, to go back to those, predominantly blokes who seem very invested in ensuring that women's work isn't valued, they're also, I think, very invested in the maintenance of those gender norms. They're very invested in the idea that men are protectors. And then when you say, well, who are you protecting us from? That's like, well, that's just the odd bad man. So then you do the unscrambling of that and talk about how there are systemic drivers of some of those things. So what if we did something about that? No, it's a few bad men. Mm-hmm. And then there's the whole question about where we set the bar for what is being a good man. Anyway, there's a lot in that, but they're inherent in all of that, I think, is this assumption, these deeply embedded cultural assumptions about men and women and what we do, and therefore how we are each of value, which a lot comes from like the fairy tale, all of those stories that we get teach us those things. And so it's like, everybody learns to say please and thank you, right? There's no law about that. Everyone just learns to do those things. Those other cultural assumptions are like that. No one necessarily says boys can only do this and girls can only do this, but somehow we absorb those notions.
So it's really quite a revolutionary act to say we should change that, because I went looking the other day to try and find an example of any society or culture that, as you say, exists without patriarchy. There's a couple of matriarchal societies, very obscure ones, one in China, I think, and a couple in ancient civilization, where they're guessing. And these are held up as, oh, look, it's an anomaly, but you scratch the surface a little bit and underneath it, actually their patriarchy still is hiding underneath the matriarchy. So to propose for the first time in human history or in recorded human history that we're going to change this. Because most of human history, there's that old saying, there's nothing new in history. Most of human history is just the same thing repeating itself. Very, very occasionally you get something new, the wheel, the internet, the Industrial Revolution, electricity. Those things do make genuine change, but they're rare. They're really rare. Most of the time, we're just going through the same cycles over and over again. So if we now are, as we have been, say, for the last 50 years, proposing to completely end the basis of society that had existed since we started forming societies, we've got nothing to work from. We've got no map, no idea what that would actually look like and how you manage the transfer of power, the peaceful transfer of power from patriarchy to a more equal society. And also my question is, what would happen then? Because it's not like women actually are the sweet, nurturing, loving, kind, generous fairy tale princesses all grown up. We're not. We're just as capable of being assholes as men are.
No. No, I refuse to accept this.
The difference is we just have less power to be assholes with. So if there was genuine power sharing between genders, people of all genders, what would the world look like?
Look, it's a really interesting question because I don't know that it would look, I've never thought about this, so I'm going to think about this on the run because I fight for it, but I don't actually think what the end point could be. I think that it would be a happier and healthier society for a start, because I think that my view is that gender norms are actually destructive for everyone, right? So we are teaching boys and men about what it is to be weak. And that means that for some, they don't feel like they're able to connect with people in the way that they might want to. And so I think that it would potentially be a happier and healthier society if we said, actually, as long as you are kind and respect each other, you can be or manifest how you want. If you want to be stoic and strong, you do that regardless of gender. And if you want to be vulnerable and open, you do that regardless of gender, and there's no particular ways that you need to be. I think that people would be happier. I think they would be healthier. I think that probably as a society, look, I'm not a big rap for saying it's important to have a strong, I do believe in a strong economy, but economic factors are not my driver. But I think that if everyone was able to reach their full potential, regardless of gender, in other words, there were no barriers to people doing the work that they wanted to do because there were no assumptions fed into them about the fact that this is closed off to you because you can't be trusted in this kind of work or whatever it is. I think that therefore, people making real, genuine choices about the work that they want to do, we would benefit from that, I reckon, because our workforce, might be happier. So I think there are those things. So I think about that. So those are the communal benefits that we get from that. Then there's the individual benefits, which are that for each person, there are far fewer barriers to them doing and living the life that they want to live. So I think those are the positives. I don't know that it will unscramble capitalism, but I think my view is the patriarchy harms all of us, but we're not good at explaining that. I think that sometimes we talk, and I've been, historically a little bit guilty of this at times, that what we do is we talk about empowering girls and women to kind of break things down. But we haven't necessarily been good at the message that says, this is really good for everyone, right? You know that if actually we don't have those assumptions about what you can be and what you can do, that's actually really good for every single person and we will all benefit from that. So actually smashing the patriarchy is something we should all be doing with baseball bats because we will all be happier.
Yeah, I've actually written about this and talked about this quite a lot before. And I think in some ways we're making strides for women and girls that were not for boys and men, even though boys and men still hold more economic power and power in all those other places, that there are so many more options that we give to little girls and to older women, to all those people who don't identify as straight white men. And we can find so many other examples to look at. You can be Beyonce, you can be Hillary Clinton, you can be anything you like. Go anywhere you like and find another woman in front of you who's already broken down some of those barriers for you. You might have to go past her and break down more, but there's already a woman on that trail. But I think for men and boys, that what I call the warrior myth, which was what the stories we used to have to tell little boys so that they would go and die on battlefields, about be a strong man. It is shameful to be weak. It is proud to be strong. It is something to be proud of that your son died on a battlefield, which I have to say, that happened to my son. I couldn't think of anything worse. But those myths that we told little boys, we haven't replaced it for them in the way we have for girls and women. We haven't given them something else, examples of men outside the warrior myth who are strong and proud and worthy of respect and admiration without being that dominant, aggressive warrior.
I've thought a lot about, because I agree with you, I've thought a lot about this because there are all of those role models for girls and women now, and there's something about the fact that they have purpose, right? Part of the purpose is breaking, like you can reach beyond, and that your purpose is to reach beyond, and it's about breaking something down. And I don't know that we've done that. Men have, like, men's purpose was a particular, like to be the protector, to be the key breadwinner, to provide for family. What do you do when actually what we are saying to women is, no, you can do all of those things too. Like, yes, your purpose is to go out and do the things and be the things. You be the breadwinner. You go and break down the things. What do you do when the prime purpose that has been given to men, that's not there anymore as prime purpose, because women are going, I don't need that, right? And I agree. I don't think we've given this idea, actually it's universal purpose. Yes, we all do the things. We all protect each other. We all do the things together. There's benefit in that, but we haven't had that conversation as a society about what that means.
About what masculinity means.
What does it mean? What does it mean to be...
If you're not the protector and provider, or you're not the only protector and provider, what makes you a man?
And we're saying to girls and women, look, you can be all these things and these are the things that you can aspire to. And I don't know that we are saying to men or boys, the story that we're giving them has changed. I know that it's a different story. So now we've got them being effectively still told, be the breadwinner, be the this. But in the meantime, girls are, and there's this interesting political divide now happening, which is that women and girls are becoming increasingly progressive about social issues and change and embracing change. And at the same time, young men are going backwards, and that's a perception of loss. There's a perception of, I think, they're becoming more conservative, I think, which is about conserving what we've got, maintaining what we've got, because there's some purpose in that still. And if they don't have that, what replaces it?
Yes, that trend of young men, particularly young men becoming more conservative, is happening all over the world. As all the places that it can be measured, it is happening, both English-speaking and non-English-speaking countries.
Yeah.
Which I find fascinating. And I found somewhere some charts that seem to indicate that the more progressive the women's movement was in that country, the more conservative the younger men were getting. And there's a gap opening up now between midlife to older men and young men, that those midlife to older men are becoming more progressive because they are seeing the benefits of it. But those younger men, and that's a really interesting way you put it, of not finding a purpose, not knowing what their purpose is.
What's the purpose? Yeah.
And even more than that, I would say it's having a purpose, and then a purpose to feel some sense of pride and self-worth in, because often what I'm hearing from young men is, oh, you hate all the men, you want to, I think I've said this before, you want to put them all in an iron box and fire them into the sun. And it's not that I'm philosophically opposed to that approach, but I don't think it's helpful. But that feeling of being under attack, that masculinity is under attack, masculinity itself is being demonized, is the word they often use to me. And I keep trying to explain, but no, what we're trying to say is masculinity is not this tiny, precious little thing that you're guarding. It's such a wide range of things. What we're saying is this tiny little box of masculinity is dangerous to you and dangerous to me. Have a look at all these other options, but they can't see those other options because there's no one living that.
And I don't know that it's, to go back to the very start, it's valued. I don't know that those other options have had value placed on them. And they're still bound up in the idea of purpose and value being a certain way, whereas girls and women are being told, you, for instance, in the book, you're unpacking all of these stories, which are the traditional way that we understand value and the way that we told girls to be valued. So Cinderella is valued because she's obedient, because she's all of those things. And now we're out there delivering a message that says, no, you don't have to be those things. You can be something else. And so we're putting value, we're saying, actually, your value isn't measured in that way. Your value isn't, it's not the ugly stepsisters. Like, your value shouldn't be measured in those ways. And so we're giving language to girls and women to revalue themselves. I don't know that we're doing that across all of society. I don't know that we're doing that with men to give them language to revalue and say, actually, my purpose is to be whatever, a good father, and this is how we measure that, happy kids and all of those things, rather than provider.
And that old thing that we've been saying to women and girls for years, if you can't be what you can't see. And so every time a woman is achieving something, there's another woman standing in front of her with a phone going click and posting it somewhere so that we can all see what all these other women are doing. I've never seen that with the way men are with each other. I've never seen men talk to each other about heroes that are not performing some kind of warrior, whether that is actual being a soldier or warrior on the sports field or warrior in politics or economics. It's some form of dominance, of the physical and aggressive dominance of other people is how you become a hero when you're a man. And I think, to me, it's something that all those older men that are talking about, oh, we're getting more progressive and we want to do something, to me, that is the most valuable thing they could do, is go and talk to those young men about your heroes. I was in a class once a few years ago where the boys in the class were pulled in because they'd sexually assaulted a teacher. It was just, anyway. One of the conversations that we had in this special program that we did for them was about heroes. Almost all of them said their dads. And then when I did the workshop with the parents and I told the dads about this, and one of them cried. And then I asked the dads if they had ever talked to their sons about who their heroes were. And none of them did. None of them knew who their son's hero was. None of the sons knew who the dad's heroes were. They just didn't talk about it. They didn't talk about other men that inspired them. They talked about sport, or they talked about being successful or being strong, but they didn't talk about role models. And it struck me as fascinating because so many of the teenage girls I talked to will not shut up about their role models. I'm a Taylor Swift fan, and even I was like, oh, I can't really handle any more conversation about Taylor Swift. Let's just stop. Come on, move on. But they are passionately devoted to their role models, and they talk and they think about what that means for their own futures and their, as you say, their value, their possibilities. Men and boys don't talk like that about aspirations and role models.
Yeah, I'm not familiar enough with the world of young men and young boys to be able to speak with any authority on this, and I suspect there are people who know a lot more about it. I think as a society, if you read most popular media, it's still operating as if things haven't changed. So it's still predominant, like pages and pages dedicated to men's sports, and then like maybe a few articles here and there. Although, again, that's starting to change, right? And so you think about AFLW and AFL, which I think should be AFLM, but that's my personal view. But if I think about that, Like that's increasingly working its way forward into the consciousness. So as a result of that, there's this cohort of men that have to go, it's really shit. AFLW is really shit. They can't play. They shouldn't blah, blah, blah. So there's this kind of need to, again, put that down, which is something, I just think, again, that's really interesting, right? That you can't just go, oh, it doesn't affect me in any way. I don't care. I'm not going to watch it. Great, whatevs. You've got to push down, and there's that kind of really solid push down. So I don't know how, because there are men doing really good work in this space. There are people doing really good work in this space to try and redefine these things. I just think that we as a society have not had the conversation about the very question you posed me, which is what would it look like? Actually, what would it look like? Like not even I, who've spent a lot of time campaigning to change these things, have actually sat down and gone, oh, what would it look like if we succeed in this thing that I'm working so hard to get to? So I just feel like we probably need to have some of those conversations together about, well, what is it that we are, like it shouldn't just be about we're going to empower women and girls. I mean, yes, we should be doing that, but actually the conversation should be broader around, well, what do we want it to look like? What does a safe, happy, prosperous society look like for everyone?
Right. And you have been doing that. You've actually been doing this work for years. You have been involved in some of the most significant changes, over the last few decades of conditions and valuing of work. And you've been part of the change that's happened. So you must have some experience of how you make change happen, because you have changed things.
Well, I mean, my starting point is you can only do it collectively, right? So I just think change, real meaningful change, can only be done by collective. So you build the collective of shared purpose, and you say, okay, because the bigger the change you want, the more people you need to bring in to your vision for what it might look like, which is why, again, that question was very interesting. But anyway, if I think about the equal pay case at the Australian Services Union for community sector workers, that took years to get those workers to the point where they were prepared to walk off the job, right? These are 87% were women. They were professional workers. They were at that stage earning 20 grand less than the average Australian wage for doing this complex, difficult work of working with family and domestic violence in refuges, doing this work in youth refuges, with work with young people, all the social work, all of the relationship counselling, all of the community legal work, all of that stuff that we as a society, we rely on. And it was incredibly undervalued. 87% of the workers were women. To get them, they had to move from saying, I do it for the love of it, to saying, I do it for love and money, right? Which is actually true. That was the truth. But they felt constrained to say that because there was something not quite right about saying, I do it for love and money. And
even that I need money to be able to do it.
To do it. And many of those workers qualified for the services that they were providing. So if they were housing homeless workers, working with homeless folks, their income was so low that in many cases they qualified for some of the services that their, organisation provided. So it was terrible, and they knew that was terrible. And so the change was made because the generation of workers who had stayed there for a long time wanted to see a flourishing sector, and they could see that young workers who were coming in were not staying.
Because they couldn't stay.
Because they couldn't afford it.
Yeah.
Right? They just couldn't afford it. So generally, men who came into the sector lasted about a year, women who came into the sector lasted about 3 years, they would move on. And it just was unsustainable. And so their shared vision was a sustainable sector where their work was valued in such a way that meant that that generation of workers knew that there was going to be a generation that stayed and was going to be able to deliver the services to the community that they believed in. And then they had to go out on the ground and they had to do stuff. They had to do shit. They had to do flash mobs and protests and rallies, and they had to go visit their MPs and have those conversations about why this was important. And they had to do that all around the country.
Was there much resistance?
There was. Well, it was going to cost $5 billion. So there was a bit of resistance on the part of politicians to begin with, because that felt like a lot of money, and it was. But they were incredibly effective communicators, these workers, because that's what they do, right? One of the fundamental skills is the capacity to communicate. And so they were very good at that. So the collective was built, and then they drove the campaign. And then we as the union drove the legal case and worked with them on what the campaign would look like. But there was a lot of that campaign that they kind of drove along the way.
And now, as I understand it, they're just slightly above minimum wage. Is that right?
Yeah, because the increase was phased in. And, of course, the issue in that sector, I mean, it's complex, but the issue primarily is there's not a lot of most workers get pay increases by negotiating them in workplaces. The problem with this kind of service is that it's very hard to negotiate. I will negotiate with you, but you're not the one who's got the money. It's the government that gives you the money. So you come to me legitimately and say, I can't pay you what you're worth because our funding is only at X amount. And so I'm bargaining to try and negotiate for better with a person who has no negotiating power really to deliver pay increases. And that's government that does that. Again, the laws have changed. So the Labor government that we have now understands that that's an issue. And so they've changed both the way that you can bargain. So they've improved the capacity for lots of workers to bargain together across more than one workplace, which is, particularly in the sectors dominated by women, is really an incredibly important thing to happen. And they also now allow this capacity to bring the government to the table with that bargaining where it's a funded sector. So when I'm negotiating with you, I can say, no, you don't have the money. I want him to come to the table because he's got the money and he can come to the table and I can negotiate with him and say, okay, we deserve better, pay us better. And particularly the kind of large-scale bargaining. So that's how, for instance, the early childhood educators have gotten that 15% pay increase, is the government has come to the table with money and said, well, you can only get this money if you agree to negotiate with your workers in this kind of arrangement where if you sign on to this, then you can get the money because then the money's guaranteed to go to those workers.
Yep, which is a case in point of join your union.
Correct. I'm statutorily required to say that at least once wherever I go, so join your union.
Does that process make it unreliable in a way because this is dependent on a friendly government? And if we get a government, say, under a ex-Queensland policeman who might be less friendly to people who want to work with fragile and vulnerable young people living on the streets and say, well, fuck you, not my problem, I'm defunding the sector, is that a risk?
It's always a risk, let's be honest, regardless of the colour of the government logo. Hasn't always been great for the sector for this kind of work. I do think one of the differences between progressive and conservative governments is that progressive governments generally have more women at the table making the decisions about what is a priority and what is not. And that helps because they are more acutely aware of the notion of the undervaluation of women's work, and so they're more likely to advocate at the table for that. So you end up then, I don't know if it's more a question of, yes, we are vulnerable, but what we are vulnerable to, I think, is governments that either prioritise women's issues or don't, and that's more likely to be the case when we have women sitting at the table making government decisions.
And it's also, I think, a matter of knowing that women in the community are engaged and they know what's going on and they care about what's going on and they will take action. And as you say, collective action, whether that's unionised action or just 25,000 of us turning up on the street to say this shit is not okay.
That's right.
Which I guess that's a good note to end on because it's about hope and it's about how we make sure that change keeps going, which is that we all have to stay involved.
Oh, we all have to stay involved.
And never, ever take anything for granted.
And we have to work together because change is exhausting.
Yes.
And so Working together means when you get tired, I can step up, and when I get tired, you step up. And between all of us together, we are a much better chance if we are all working to common purpose.
That was Wil Stracke, and that was episode 2. Don't forget, if you want to buy the Fairy Tale Princesses Will Kill Your Children book, you can get it direct from my website if you're in Australia, or from your preferred online bookseller anywhere else. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week to talk about sleeping beauty and consent with Lauren French, the Head of Education at Body Safety Australia.
Every relationship, every, conversation between people, there is a power imbalance. And power imbalance is not inherently evil or negative or, wicked witch cackle, but they can be. And if they're not addressed, then the person who is often in the position of power, holding more power against another person, is sometimes unaware of how that power is affecting the other people around them.